There we go. I am here with Aaron Rabinowitz, the co-host of Philosophers in Space, which is a great show, podcast about science fiction and philosophy. And he's also, where I found him first, the host of Embrace the Void, which is a great philosophy channel. And it gets into philosophy, a little bit of debate, gets into human rights, gets into all sorts of things I really enjoyed. And the very first one I listened to was with his dad, and I'll have more to say about that later. So, Aaron Rabinowitz, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
The one thing I spoke to you before about is you've explained moral luck in 5 minutes or less generally, and I'm sure the one person who isn't also one of the Philosophers in Space subscribers may not know what moral luck is, and I'm a little shaky on it myself.
So you want me to explain that then, for starters?
Oh, please, yes. Sorry.
No, you're fine. Yeah, this is certainly my philosophical hobby horse. Moral luck is this idea was put forward by a couple of individuals. There's a very famous paper that I particularly love by Nagel that lays out the problem, which is we have a conflict, it seems, between two brute facts, right? One is we want to hold people morally responsible, and it seems like the only time that someone can be held morally responsible is if their actions were under their control in some robust kind of way. When we try to think about moral responsibility, if we think of a situation where someone had no control over their actions or the outcome of their actions, we would sort of naturally think that that would take away their moral responsibility, right? The problem is when you start to pick away at what we actually have control over, Nagel argues, it seems like we ultimately have control over nothing. That like the illusion of control breaks down, and that at every level, everything is determined by luck in the sense of forces that are driven by things beyond our control. So moral luck refers to specifically situations where a person is held morally responsible for something that is not under their control, which we might ultimately argue is every time that someone is held morally responsible, because nothing is under our control. I think that, yeah.
So this is like a more a more expansive version of, okay, we have no free will, so.
Yeah, it's very closely tied to the idea of having no free will. Like, I think what we mean when we talk about free will is what we're really trying to get at is what kind of control do we have over the actions that we engage in. And I think when most people think about their free will, they have a sort of simplistic kind of libertarian idea that they have something inside of them that is them, and that thing has control of the situation to some more or less degree, right? You might feel out of control in some situations and more in control in other situations, but you think that there's a you in there that is sort of pulling the strings ultimately in making a lot of your decisions. And this argument basically says that there is no such thing, that like you can find no independent entity inside of the self that has any robust kind of control, that the entities within you are all sort of forces that were put there prior to any time in your life when you could be said reasonably to have decided on anything. And so I think focusing in this way on control rather than like, could I have chosen to do otherwise, which gets into weird, confusing questions, is a better way to make sense of the problem of free will. And when we understand it that way, I think it becomes quite clear that we don't have what we mean, what we want when we talk about free will, which is something that could ground moral responsibility and robust personhood.
the way I've always thought about free will, which is incredibly simplistic, is that we don't have free will, but we can't tell either way, so it doesn't really matter. So we might as well be. So our lack of free will forces us to pretend we have free will.
Yeah, and I think that there is some truth to that, but I think our understanding of this can be a corrective for our sort of simplistic, evolved feelings about the idea of responsibility and freedom. So, to give a concrete example, right, that I've talked about before, um, when we try to assess, if someone committed a crime because of a variety of systemic factors that like contributed to these cycles of criminal behavior versus whether they, as a particularly bad spirited individual, chose to do a bad thing because they wanted to do a bad thing or because they wanted to get away with doing it or something like that, right? So whenever we, especially on the left, try to lay out these systemic arguments for explaining problematic behavior in such a way that doesn't fixate on the individual as the sole locus of the sole location of responsibility, what we are essentially doing is mustering a kind of these luck arguments. The same thing goes for like privilege arguments. When we talk about privilege, we're also talking about a very real kind of luck that is pervasive and that drives behavior. And so all my position does is take up where most people already are right now, which is a lot of things aren't under my control, but maybe a couple of things are, and try to push you over the line to nothing is under one's control in a robust way, all the way down, right? And that's okay. And it's like it's better to think that way because you will react better both to situations in your own life and to situations on a societal level, I think.
I think, well, I'm obviously, this being a trans atheist channel, I've got to get into some of the LGBTQ questions. Sure. But I will say that of the 15, 20, 70 factors that made me come out when I did, exactly then was thinking about the idea of control and moral luck as you were explaining it.
So how so? Can you explain a little more how those things connected together for you?
Essentially, I had what you would call the choice to not do it for ages and ages, and eventually, I looked back at everything I was writing and for years, for 30 years worth of stuff, and going, this is who I am. This is not who I am. Is not who I think I am, and I just have to go with who I really am. So the choice was more or less taken away from me. A lot of people talk about hitting a wall and stuff, but it's not exactly what it's like. It's more like, okay, this is untenable, and my as much as I'm trying to exert some kind of free will over not, and not be that person, that's who I am.
Yeah. I like the Taoist metaphors for it when they talk about the Tao as a giant river and that we're all sort of floating along in a river, and you can swim against the current as hard as you want for as long as you can, but eventually you run out of energy to swim against the current. And I think a lot of what I think is valuable about the no control sort of moral luck views is it requires us to be a lot more honest about the current, which paradoxically I think makes us more functional because it makes us able to swim with the current.
Yeah, as much as I'm 54 years old. I was 53, and as much as this is a little late for me to be just giving into the current and trying to exert control over it was not a thing I could do. And the Tao River was also a factor. There was personal factors, there was family factors, there was a lot of things that went on that made it July 9th.
Right. Yeah, Nagel talks about a couple of different kinds of moral luck. He talks about luck of consequences, which is sort of the easier one to dismiss. Like, you get lucky and you don't accidentally kill someone in a car accident while you're driving drunk or something. That's
right.
Kind of luck that we don't see every day. Or we see it in terms of like, because of the color of your skin, you're lucky enough not to get pulled over while you're carrying weed or something like that. Whereas the luck of circumstances and the luck of constitution are the much harder kinds of moral luck to shake when we're talking about real genuine control. The easier one is the circumstances one, right? You're born into a situation like, we can see how if someone is born into the easy example is, right, 1940s Germany or something, 1930s Germany, right? You're born then, you're raised in that period, right? Even if you don't become a Nazi, and the odds are you would become a Nazi, right? You are forced to deal with life and death, horrifying choices that a person born, well, it's not, I mean, I can't say about 10 years from now in America, but I think at present right now in America, right? It's right. There are other places where you could be born that were easier to deal with than 1930s Germany, is what I'm saying. And that's an important kind of luck that a lot of people aren't aware of. We think of it in the modern world in terms of like, are you born in a more developed country versus a developing country? Are you born in a country that is more susceptible to climate change or less susceptible to climate change? But the real hard one is the luck of constitution, which is what I think you're describing, which is, all the factors that go into making whoever you are you. And like, who you are is a complex, constructed, organic, not really substantially existing in an independent kind of way, but existing in a importantly real in an enacted kind of way. And that you is 100% all the way down, your beliefs, your behaviors, everything, in my opinion, the result of things beyond your control, right? Like,
absolutely.
Both your resistance to being trans and your ultimate acceptance of it, both of those things were things that were beyond your control. Neither one of them was like the real separate you or something like that, right? They were these competing forces that existed in you over the course of your life.
Well, yeah. I was thinking a lot yesterday about Christopher having been a costume I put on for a long time, and Christy being, the person that was there, but this is one of the hard things to try and dope out. A lot of trans people, and I'm going to speak for myself here, but I've talked to other trans people. They find the old self to be completely dead, to be a complete other person, and I don't. I think of this as a continuation, just taking off the costume, which is because I made, the Taoist stream. This is weirdly enough the second week in a row I'm talking about that.
Yeah. No, I think that there can be, identity as a construction, as this weird fluid construction, can take so many different kinds of forms that, like, I think it really is hard to talk about like everyone has to view it this way or everyone has to experience it this way. So I think it's interesting that you have that particular different take on it. Since this is an atheist forum, I should also at least throw out my atheist credentials that like Buddhism and Taoism as philosophical models, but I am definitely an atheist. And like when I talk about determinism, I'm talking about psychological and physical forms of determinism, not cosmic meaning kinds of determinism. I don't think there is any cosmic meaning. I think there is objective moral truth, but it's not there because some god put it there. So I just wanted to throw that down.
Well, you can always try and argue the Calvinist mindset and roughly come to the same place. But
are we allowed to curse on here?
You are absolutely allowed to.
Oh yeah, okay, good. Fuck Calvinism. Calvinism is the worst of all possible religions. Calvinism is like the dark nega version of what I believe in. It's like if I had to fight another philosophy at the final round before the boss, that would be what it would be. Fuck Calvinism. Pick all the worst parts of every kind of philosophy and put them together, and you get Calvinism.
I think of it as you put a fedora on it and make it an atheist, and it would make a lot of money on YouTube.
Right. Well, actually, God chose some people to just have higher IQs because they're blessed.
Pretty much.
Easy.
Yeah, I wandered a lot in religion, so my religion only left me when I was in my mid-40s. So
there are religions that I think people can be, and that's fine. And there are people who are good people who are religious. I think it would be better if people weren't religious, but I think there are functional compromise positions that I'm willing to accept. Thoroughgoing Calvinism is pretty much off the table. Like, I guess you can still be a good person, but boy, is that a bad belief structure.
Well, objectivism, I think, is the worst religion. But
sure, it's certainly amongst the bad things.
But Calvinism certainly does not swipe. I do not swipe right for Calvinism.
No, it is objectively immoral.
Well, as far as the moral argument, and this is one thing you talked about a little bit, but I hadn't really asked you about it before. I have asked you how you became a trans ally, which you're certainly welcome to repeat. And I'd appreciate it if you did. But just in general, how the idea of moral luck and LGBTQ plus identities work together.
Yeah, I guess I can't point to a specific time when I became a trans ally because I grew up with hippies and went to a hippie summer camp and like knew people who were trans before it became, I think, a big social issue. And like it was also a big LGBTQ camp before, even before a lot of that terminology became sort of culturally widespread. It was back when it was called free love in a lot of places, right? And just meant free love and free expression. So like I was on board with that stuff for my entire life and was always very pro fluid identity, identity as social construct kind of stuff, even like before all of this. And then you get into the academic side of it and you start to understand the background philosophies behind it, and you also start to get into the social science stuff and understand the history of feminism and the development of distinctions between sex and gender. So all of that I think is really important. And so how all of this ties in with moral luck is, in some ways, I think it's useful to lump sort of, even though sexuality and gender expression are different things, they should be lumped together in the sense of they are parts of your identity that while they are expressed are, again, like everything else, expressed as a result of things I think ultimately beyond your control. So whether it's, genes or, whether it's nature or nurture doesn't matter, because both nature and nurture occur so early on in your life and compound so much over the course of your life that like no one can be said to have chosen any of this, I think, in any reasonable kind of way. And so from there, we get yet another justification for why we should sort of adopt the liberal perspective on letting people engage in and encouraging people to engage in lifestyles that feel good to them and make them happy and that don't cause them any kind of substantial harm, right? You can get into debates about competing ethical values when you're talking about like how far do you let people go in terms of what kind of lifestyles you let them engage in, even if it only causes harm to themselves versus causes somehow or another, like drug use would be another example of this kind of conversation. But I think when you combine the empirical evidence about being gay, being trans, being non-binary, all of these kinds of expressions that people are developing and exploring in the modern world, when you combine those with this luck kind of view, you get a pretty strong argument for why you should encourage people to do that kind of exploration and not try to shoehorn everyone into one particular lifestyle.
One of the things I used to say, and it was probably pretty facile, but was especially when I was dealing with a lot of gay rights issues in the 80s, they'd always say, it's a choice. And I'm like, okay, say it was a choice. Where does that actually matter?
Right.
Why would that matter? If somebody chose to be, that's cool. Because everybody always makes the argument, well, why would we choose to be marginalized? I don't like that argument. I never did.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought, if it's a choice, then cool, it's a choice.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Even though I don't believe I must say I don't believe it's a choice, and I very much don't believe it's a choice at this point.
Right. I mean, I agree with you in the hypothetical that, like, if it were a choice, that wouldn't change the calculus. So, but part of that is because I think we have to understand what we mean by it being a choice, right? On my view, even things that are quote unquote a choice are still, when you decide them, they're decided by factors beyond your control. So, this is why, first of all, I think it's good to avoid the question of like, oh, I could have chosen differently, right? Like, we don't really have a good way to test claims about could have chosen differently or even know exactly what that means. You chose one thing, right? You chose that thing because you were determined to choose that thing. You are a part of the complex causal fabric of the universe. You don't sit outside of its sort of systems of causality. And so in that sense, on a variety of levels, it seems like you were determined to choose that thing. So, whether that is determined by pure genetics or a mix of genetics and experiences doesn't really matter. And like calling it a choice, I agree with you, doesn't seem to change the calculations at all. So I do think that's a good way. That's a good way to avoid talking about that, by just sort of being honest about control, right? You don't really have control over these things in any robust kind of way, even if you call it a choice.
Yeah, and it's as the last year went on, I realized choice was not exactly where I was going with anything. I can maybe call some things I did when I was young the choice, but I don't think so now.
Well, I have a game I like to play whenever we talk about this, when it gets to questions of specific choices. And usually specific choices fall into two categories. It's either small trivial actions that people claim were freely decided because they were underdetermined, because there was no reason to do one versus another, or big monumental claims, big monumental actions where people think that had to have been freely chosen or something I had control over because it was this huge, person defining moment in my life. And I think for both kinds of games, you can always play this sort of simple infinite regress, as we like to do in philosophy, right? Where you just repeatedly ask the question, if you chose to do that thing, let's assume for the sake of argument, you chose to do it, right?
Right.
Did you choose to do it because of a reason or not because of a reason, right? These are your two options, right? If you chose to do it for a reason, we can ask of that reason, did you choose that reason? And if so, what did you choose it based on? Did you have a reason, right? Ad infinitum, until you find, I chose this thing because I really like it. And I really like it because I had a positive experience of it when I was a small child. And it always reminds me of that positive experience, right? You didn't choose to have that positive experience as a small child. You weren't choosing anything at that point. Like, you lucked into your parents taking you on a fun Ferris wheel or something like that, right? You know what I mean? So anything that you do can be traced back in these kinds of causal lines to things that were far earlier than we could assign any responsibility to you. So if you have a reason, it's always going to come back to these things that are, the forces that led to that reason being the salient one to motivate you, and those forces being beyond your control. And then the alternative is you didn't do it for any reason at all, right? I randomly raised my right arm versus my left arm, but I had no reason to pick the right arm or something. I don't think that really means whether it really qualifies what we think of as willing in a robust kind of way. And you can hash around like, oh, well, you lifted the arm for the purpose of proving that you have free will, and you chose that arm because you're right arm dominant, even if you weren't consciously thinking about it at that particular moment or something, right? You can explain the reasons for why that particular action occurred. And even further, you can say, well, look, when we really talk about free will, what we really try to meet, what we want is someone who acts for reasons, but they're the reasons that individual chose in some genuinely free kind of way, right? When I chose to harm this other person for my own benefit, I genuinely, as a free individual in some sense, picked the harm for them versus the benefit for myself, right? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. So like in my case, it's trans turtles all the way down, basically.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Or I know the Philosophers in Space Facebook group is obsessed with trolley problems.
Right.
Under the idea of no choice of infinite regress on choices, the trolley problem makes no sense to begin with.
I mean, so here's the thing, right? All the things that I've said do impact our behavior, but I don't think they take it to a standstill or something like that. Take yourself, for example, right?
Yeah.
You're still enacting your life because your reasons for doing what you're doing aren't because you were free to do them. It's because they feel good and you value them. And we can say, look, it was beyond your control to value these things versus something else. And that's fine. And you can still go through your life valuing those things and enjoying them and leading a good life. And that can be a good thing, I think, in an objective kind of way. So I do think that like objective value and objective morality persist even if everything is beyond our control. We're just kind of along for the ride, right? We don't get to have the value of enacting some kind of weird radical freedom upon the world. We get to have the value of a really interesting, complex roller coaster.
I'm going to change the subject, and
Okay.
I choose to change the subject in a particularly strange way. So that brings me to what confluence of cosmic forces caused you to create Monster Island, which for those who don't know, it was a Facebook group.
Still is.
Well, as far as I know, it doesn't exist, and I don't.
It's probably for the best.
It was supposed to be a free argument group without rules, and then it wound up having to have rules because Piggy stole the conch, and
yeah, basically. Yeah, so right around the time that I was also starting Embrace the Void podcast after well no, I guess Monster Island probably precedes that a little bit because it was before the election, because it arose out of a bunch of flaming dumpster fire conflict arguments that I had on Facebook with some people who I met through a mutual friend who were conservatives during the 2016 election. And those conversations were so toxic that like I had people messaging me, begging me to, to take these off their feeds in some way or another. So what we did was we set up a private group called Monster Island so that it was safely removed from normal humans where people could argue. And the idea was to try to actually avoid setting up an echo chamber and to have a balance of sort of left and right people to argue about various topics through the election and afterwards. And the other goal was sort of a test of libertarianism in a sense, or anarchism, depending on which terminology you prefer. But essentially a place where things are, there are no specific rules. There's no kicking anyone from the group. Everything is on the table. With the interesting question of like, would any sort of norms emerge? Would rules become required? What would happen? And what basically happened was a nightmare of there were bad people on both sides, I'll put it that way, but there was sort of a concerted effort of very right-wing people to engage in some particularly horrific behavior, things like doxing people and photoshopping family members into inappropriate pictures and things like stuff that ended up forcing us to like make specific rules, and like it became more and more of a hassle. And also, the reality was the content was not particularly good. And part of that is I genuinely think is because the right in our country especially is in a crazy death cult spiral ideologically that makes them really difficult to engage with in any way, no matter how aggressively open to engagement you are. And like, there were a couple of moderate centrists and right-wing centrists in that group who I have support and respect for and the utmost sympathy for. And I feel bad for them that like the rest of their party has skipped town for, Trump cult land. So yeah, that's pretty much, and my personal experience of it after, I guess, a year or so of arguing there consistently was realizing that this is not constructive, that the information I need about perspectives on the right is not something that I really need a space to actually get from these people, and that it was a giant waste of energy for me personally. And so I left. I mean, I still own the group technically, but I handed off leadership to other people and, walked away from it. And I'm much happier. And it was a personal sort of study for me of like what happens when you try to not have an echo chamber. And the answer is that's good as long as as long as there isn't a substantial portion of really bad faith actors. And the problem is the right is just overrun with bad faith actors at the moment.
Well, my leaving of Monster Island was me deliberately breaking the rules like one after the other. So I did it like 10 times in a row. I said this way I will never be allowed back on. And that's a good thing
for everyone.
Yeah, it was a good thing because I was so upset by that place by the end. The Strangely enough, I remember what the date was I entered, and why what the very first thing I saw was an anti-trans screed by someone we
Mm-hmm.
both know.
Sure.
No names. Um, and I came in swinging, which was not my intention when I heard about it, but that is
Mm-hmm.
kind of where a lot of the times I turned into a person I didn't like there, and
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
was
and like I should say I don't think this is the only way that interacting with other groups necessarily always goes. I don't want to give that impression. There are groups like I don't know if they're called Change My Mind or something like that. Not the Crowder crap, obviously, but like there's
yeah.
another group that's sort of a very popular debate, not debate oriented, but disagreement oriented, and they have sort of both rules and useful guidelines that I think are very interesting for how actual changing of minds can happen. And one of the things they highlight that nobody on the internet does, but is an interesting point, is that they argue that when people actually do change their minds, it's during back and forth that don't go on very long, like no more than 4 or 5 back and forth comments really. Beyond that, like if you get into a giant back and forth with someone, the odds of them changing their perspective actually drop substantially. So
Well,
one thing to consider is doing sort of more like engage with a couple of comments and then back away.
that's more in my realm. The reinforcement psychology
Mhm.
of argument. The more you argue for something, the more it's reinforced, which is freaking obvious. you
Right.
know, um, the you also have another group, which is Philosophers in Space, which is a wonderful group, and
Hmm.
you are called their cult leader for reasons I have yet to figure out.
Benevolent cult leader. Because
Well, most of the time.
in the modern age, all branding is cult. And I think my feeling is the best way to avoid becoming a bad kind of cult is call yourself a cult openly and as ironically as possible. Um, because it sort of takes the piss out of your own branding, right? Like it's such an absurd idea, and like you can talk about what we actually mean by real cults, right? Real bad cults are cults that isolate people from their families, isolate people from information, um, take advantage of people in monetary and physical ways, right? And we don't do any of that in this kind of cult, right? We're much more like a stranger in a strange land kind of cult, right? A cult of
Well, there is Patreon. You are separating us from money.
sure. I mean, we do appreciate the support for the content. Um and I try, I honestly, and this is where sort of Thomas and I we don't conflict too much on it, but it's like, and I understand where he's coming from totally, right? He is like, we're making a product and people enjoy that, and it takes time and energy, so we have to pay bills, so it makes sense to make money from that. I have a hard time with that as an educator because I want all education to be free and readily accessible to everyone.
Yes.
So, right, paywalls make me uncomfortable. Um, but at the same time, I live in a country where education is undervalued. I'm lucky enough to get to teach at all, and so um, yeah, I accept the necessities of it, but uh, I definitely try to avoid being an exploitative kind of cult.
Oh,
Certainly encourage no one to support us at a cost to their own substantial well-being.
oh yeah. I mean, I had to drop out of the patronizing, but you let me stay in the group, which was nice.
Oh yeah, it's an open group for anyone, even if you're not a patron, and it's also the group for Embrace the Void, so everyone can come join. So,
yeah, um, Embrace the Void is what sent me over to Monster Island in the first place. So I was wary when
Philosophers in Space is not Monster Island. It's much nicer.
It's
It's interestingly the opposite. Genuinely, in the sense that so I was saying, there are other ways things can go, right?
Yeah.
Philosophers in Space, I don't have to manage hardly at all, right? Maybe once a month there's a tiny little squabble, and I drop some comment about let's all not overreact to this ridiculous squabble, and we all move on very quickly. Why that is an interesting question. Why is the group dynamic so different in that group? It's partly, I think, because it's a largely very left-leaning, but also non-political. I mean, we talk about some social justice issues, but I wouldn't call it a rabidly leftist. I mean, everyone in there I think is pretty left, but we're not always talking about it. We mostly joke about it, right? For a number of billionaire humor, anti-billionaire humor.
Yes.
But yeah. So I go. Sorry.
Oh no! The interesting thing is that when it started out, it had almost all of the same members.
Yeah, and some of the better conservatives have stuck around, which is nice.
Yes.
But I think it's also just an attitude. I think communities reinforce norms, and if the norms are very clear and reinforced in a healthy kind of way, you don't actually tend to get a lot of resistance to those norms.
That's true. Although they have to be healthy norms, as
sure,
don't be here after sundown is a community norm you don't want to enforce,
right?
Or anti-LGBT or bathroom bills. And sorry, this stuff is on my mind. It's why I did the channel. Went back to the channel in the first place.
Sure. No, I understand.
The one thing now, just because I didn't mention it before, I have no way to smoothly mention it in here. But one of the coolest things, when I came out on a very short Facebook sentence, which said, I am coming out as a trans woman. That's all it said.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. Your dad was the first one to react, and he hearted me, and it was like a big weight off my back. So you were like 15th or 16th, so I'm just asking you, what took you so damn long?
Oh, that's the problem. I'm too online, so if I don't like something within a minute, people start to get anxious. And it's not. I've tried to back away from compulsively liking everything, so that I don't feel like if I don't like something, people think that I hate them. Yeah, and my father is the first to mention that trans issues are not new. Respect for them is new, but these issues go back. They were talking about these issues when he was growing up, and trans activists were centrally involved in a lot of the in the Stonewall riots and a lot of these major achievements in LGBTQ history. So I'm not surprised at all that he's on board.
Yeah, I mean, you said you were raised a hippie, so I'm guessing that's one of the hippies that raised you.
Yeah, and he wears he likes to call it his dress. It's a caftan kind of situation around the house a fair bit, because he finds that far more comfortable than the traditional pants and shirt ensemble. So we like to joke, given his history in theater and some of his mannerisms, that he's in many ways the gayest straight person you ever met.
Okay.
I think we're far enough along that we can make that comparison.
No, it's I trust me. There's a gay bar I go to for karaoke on Wednesday nights, and um, the transest person I've ever seen. I asked for pronouns and said he. Oh, he. I'm like, oh, okay.
Uh-huh.
And I sort of walked away in a daze and didn't know what to do.
Uh-huh.
I think I insulted this poor person, and but looks cuter than I do, so
I mean,
got better
are you
makeup.
by asking at this point, I suppose.
Well, yeah, it's of all places you think it'd be okay to ask somebody,
Right.
but the one of the things since we are political and you're political, I'm political.
Sure. Political
Uh,
as fuck.
the um, yeah. What what do we make when I'm trying to get I understand the psychology. The psychology is my realm, right? But I don't understand the philosophy behind what the hell is going on right now. And I, I when you talked about moral luck before, I'm gonna say I'm a Hispanic. I'm Hispanic. I'm I'm Spanish and Portuguese, third generation and first generation. So it's I'm not that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't look at my sister and mom certainly do. I
Mm-hmm.
certainly look very white, so I don't. That's a problem I don't have. Um, but what is the? I don't even know how to ask the question properly. I had it framed before I started on my little thing
Mm-hmm.
there. Um, what is the philosophy behind what's going on right now? How do we make sense of it in a in a more philosophical sense?
Which specific thing that's going on right now?
Just let's say the well, what's big on my mind is the anti other that's going
Mm-hmm.
on, the racism, the rampant, the open, even homophobia, and I thought we kind of almost solved that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what you mean exactly by the philosophy behind it, because I think a lot of what's behind it is the psychology side, like you were describing, that a lot of this is anger and fear at rapid change within society, exacerbated by, the motivated reasoning of people who want to remain in power. I mean, I guess the philosophy we can talk about that I do think is important in all of this is a kind of view that too much change too fast is destabilizing the world in some kind of way. I just had a long debate on Embrace the Void with Bo Weingard from Quillet about this,
Right.
that like there is a lot of um animus against examples of what feel like rapid change to people. So I think this is why the trans stuff often comes up quite a bit. It's not actually new, these issues, but it is indicative to a lot of people. It's exemplary in some people's minds of rapid social upheaval that makes them uncomfortable. And I think what's going on right now is substantial backlash against all of the progress that we've made in the past 20 or 30 years in terms of letting people be allowed to live a variety of lifestyles when there are a lot of folks who still genuinely think those lifestyles are dangerous and immoral.
I did listen to the wine yard thing, and I really wish I still drank. It was
the wrong week to stop sniffing glue.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to ask you. You won't have an answer. I don't have an answer, and I've looked into it.
At least you're understanding that I don't have answers. That's good.
Yeah. Why the fuck does the trans in sports thing come up all the time? It's not an issue. It's not a thing.
Yeah.
It's indicative of something that I can't put my finger on.
I think it's the spot at which the people who have the kind of anxiety that I was just describing feel like they are on the strongest ground when it comes to science, common sense, ethics, and social sort of perspectives at this point, right? And that it presents for them a very effective wedge issue to cleave trans issues away from other feminist issues and away from other LGBT LGBTQ issues. That's why it's a hot target for them, I think, because of the complexities, the philosophical complexities around the relationship between gender and sex, and because of a variety of other contingent factors, and because of, I think, the realities of biological differences between sexes. People feel like these are the spots at which this stuff is going too far in a way that they think they can make a strong case that it's really going too far, and it's causing specific harm to targets that are highly sympathetic, which are female athletes in this case. So yeah, I think that's the confluence of forces, or most of the confluence of forces, that comes together to make it the sort of go-to target issue for people with arguments.
What I've found is a lot of the arguments, however, are very patronizing, paternal. That's the word.
Paternalistic, yeah.
Paternalistic, yeah. Which is kind of anti-feminist, but it's on the feminist bandwagon where the feminists don't like to. And all of this just makes me go, I don't know. I saw this coming up in the UK, I mean, it hit big time in the atheist community with the Rationality Rules video, which I don't know if you ever went and saw what was going on.
Which video?
The Rationality Rules, who was a friend of the ACA, with
the whole situation. Yeah, I saw how that sort of caught fire.
Yeah, that's how it hit America, though. Oddly enough, it was a big thing in England already, and
sure, and it's gotten to Australia now as well.
Yeah.
So like my typical response, and this was the response that I gave in that debate as well, is I'm willing to have a discussion about the complexities of trans, and it's only trans women is the only issue that anyone wants to talk about. Let's be honest. First of all, nobody cares about people who transition to being men, because the view is that, if we're being charitable of the other position, what they're arguing is men who transition to being women have a advantage in competition against cis women. Now, the evidence, as far as I can tell on that, is inconclusive at this point. There is not substantial evidence enough to argue conclusively that trans women carry with them any sort of advantage in terms of going to a different sport. But I think we can bracket off that question. What we should do is you should bracket off the question and say, look, first, let's agree on a couple of other things. Let's agree that trans women are women, right, full stop, and that they should be treated as such in as many ways as are functionally possible within society, barring some massive justification to the contrary, right? So trans bathrooms, for example, right? Trans women in bathrooms, right? If you could show through a study or something that like 100% of, and obviously not the case, right? 100% of trans women are sexual predators or something, right? Then you could make a case for why you shouldn't allow trans women into female bathrooms, right? But you don't have that. You have nothing like that. You have quite the opposite, right? They are less likely, it seems like, to engage in any sort of harmful behavior. So they should be given, they should be treated equally in that particular situation. And so it's important, I think, to first get people to commit to respecting the rights of trans women as women in society, which includes then the right to participate in sports the same as everyone else, right? The right to fair competition within sports. So that gets you a strong, at least prima facie reason, right? All things being equal, reason for letting trans women compete just like cis women in sports without any sort of separate expectations or a separate league or something like that. Right. Once you get there, then I'm willing to let experts in science debate the implications of that for various sports and talk about, if this causes particular problems and are there ways to work around it? Like, should you have, weight classes in a particular sport or height classes, different ways to carve these things up? Because another important thing to include here is there is no absolute fairness within sports. There's no way to arrange sports that allows for fairness. The question is, what kinds of unfairness are you accepting, right? Like, Michael Phelps has a variety of physical advantages that make him, the perfect swimmer in a sense, right? Beals right now in gymnastics, right? There are these exemplars. Serena Williams, right, is just they're on a different planet from other human beings, and you could argue that, like, by that fact, they are skewing everything anyway. So the question becomes, even if it were the case that trans women have some tiny, small advantage when it comes to engaging in sports activity, if it isn't more than the advantage that Michael Phelps has, is it something that should lead to them being excluded, right? You have the example of Castor, right, where she has higher testosterone levels, and like, if you found out that Serena Williams had much higher testosterone levels, would that invalidate all of her success as a female athlete? I think that's problematic, and there are, I think, good reasons for why, generally speaking, these organizations have shied away from requiring genetic testing or things like that. So it's complicated, right?
One of the things that has been brought up to me recently in that area, which recently as in 2 days ago, so it's again fresh on my mind, is the East Germans used to use transsexual men. I'm like, transsexual women. Like, well, the person called them men, but like,
use
no, it's in the Olympics because they use, but
right.
You're too young. You're such a baby, but
I know what you're talking about. I mean, like, so
they didn't. It's not a thing. It wasn't a thing. It was.
Right.
It was a talking point.
Right. There's a lot of myths around testosterone and how it works, and male bodies and what they can do. But the evidence, I mean, as far as I've seen so far, is that increasing your testosterone beyond your natural levels does allow for increased performance in a variety of ways. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about various kinds of illegal doping drugs, right? We're talking about artificial testosterone that bumps your testosterone levels way up. That being said, for trans individuals who are not taking testosterone at all and have their current levels of testosterone, there is no, as far as I can tell, there is no evidence that they have some sort of performance enhancement as a result of that stable, within their normal parameters, testosterone levels.
Oh yeah, this is. I mean, it's because it came up on the interview with Bo is the only reason I'm bringing it up with you in general.
Sure. And we did a whole episode, I'll say, with Rachel McKinnon, Dr. Rachel McKinnon, who is I
was just about to mention her. I brought this thing up. She sent me a bunch of stickers, and you can't see it, but it says, it has a toilet on it, and says, a trans person was here and nothing bad happened. So,
that's great.
Dr. McKinnon is aces in my books.
Yeah, and we had her on the show, and she was wonderful. And she's got a really good long lecture that people should watch on YouTube, where she goes through the science about the testosterone stuff that I think is really helpful.
Oh, they actually had. Well, I hadn't seen it, so I will go do that.
Yeah, I think you'll like it. It's got some good stuff in it.
Cool. I mean, it's nice that we at least know some good people in common.
Sure.
Yeah, I made a big. On Twitter, I made a big case for try and get Rachel McKinnon on the show when you'd already had her, and I felt kind of silly.
Oh, she's great.
Anyway, we've gone a little bit over an hour.
Oh, no problem.
I'm still willing to go like I said, a couple more hours if you wanted to, but I think we've gotten everything. How do you solve the trolley problem? I think is my last question. Which
trolley problem? There's a lot of them.
The main one. The basic one, the 1 in 5.
I like to hope that I would flip the switch and kill the 1 to save 5. But I don't know if I would psychologically. But I do think that's the moral thing to do.
Yes. I have the same thing. I would actually just break down crying and be a fetus on the ground. That's pretty much how I would deal with that.
I mean, if there is such a thing as moral habituation, it's the training yourself that when the time comes to do the right thing, you can do it, even when it's, you have to use that reflex, right? You can't will yourself to do it. It just has to happen, right? So going back to our moral luck view, right? I think people either get lucky enough to be habituated into acting morally, or they don't. And that's bad luck for them, and we should have pity and compassion for those who have the unfortunate luck of not being moral, which is hard.
I still get to be moral, even if I would absolutely break down crying and be unable to do anything, right?
Oh, absolutely. My other perspective as a pluralist, right, I really do think that there are multiple right answers to certain ethical questions. Because look, in the trolley problem, the reason that the trolley problem is important not because you get the right answer. It's important because it exemplifies the problem of ethics, which is there are 2 right answers, right? From a deontological perspective,
of course,
you ought not to sacrifice 1 person for the sake of 5, right? If we switch it from the trolley problem to the murder hospital, right? You shouldn't kill the innocent person and divvy up their organs to save 5 other people. So, there really are genuine conflicting moral truths here. And so someone who chooses not to do it, I think could still be considered a moral person, and somebody who freezes up in the moment because they're overcome by the horror of two unacceptable moral decisions, I think we have to have sympathy and compassion for them and not sort of view that as wildly unethical or something like that.
In my own defense, and I think we'll more or less leave with this. In my own defense, I did once run out into traffic to grab someone out.
There you go.
But
You did the thing.
I did the thing. But, traffic is easy. Trolleys are hard.
But you'd have a lever. It's a lot easier than running.
This is true. It has been wonderful talking to you. You are on Embrace the Void podcast, which I highly recommend, and Philosophers in Space. I think Thomas just gets too many podcasts, so I'm not going to recommend that. But I did Patreon that for a while.
Fair enough.
Just to give you some money for whatever. And I've had a great time talking to you. I always do online, and I'm grateful to be your parasocial friend.
Yeah, I enjoy it as well, and I appreciate you being an active member of our Definitely Not a Cult.
Okay, with that, I shall go down and do my obeisance after speaking with the leader.
There's a strict no worship rule in our cult. Worship is absolutely forbidden. That is the only thing that is forbidden in our cult. Violating two things: violating consent and worship. Those are amongst the things that you're not allowed to do in our cult.
Yes, violating consent is highest on my list of things you don't do.
Yeah.
No, wait. Yeah, okay. It works regardless of the fact that I mangled the sentence.
No, I get you. Well, thank you so much for having me on. This has been fun.
This has been terrific. Tell your dad hi, and so, and tell your wife hi. Actually, I was a fan of hers too. I didn't know you were related.
Yeah, we keep it on the DL,
And I will see you online.
Yep, sounds great.
Okay, bye. Oh, wait. I got to say like and subscribe, and I have a PayPal down there because YouTube doesn't think I should make money yet. I forgot to do that first. All right. Thank you very much. All right.
All right, I'll catch you later.
Bye.